One of the key principles on which America was founded was that of Judeo-Christian values. From the very start of colonization, many who came to the colonies did so for religious freedom, the right to worship God as they chose, not how the king demanded. The Pilgrims who came on the Mayflower began the Mayflower Compact by praising God. William Penn and the Quakers established Pennsylvania as a safe haven for Christians. Penn's Charter of Privileges even stated that Pennsylvania colonial officials had to be believers in Jesus Christ. The Great Awakening was a spiritual Christian revival in the colonies led by George Whitefield and later Jonathan Edwards. Whitefield preached to all colonists, including the commoners and the poor, which wasn't done in Britain. Whitefield and Edwards both preached that all people, regardless of status, were equal in the eyes of God. This was a new teaching at the time, but it changed the mindset of the colonists who began to believe that they were created equal by God. This is what began the revolution in America. John Adams later said the revolution wasn't the war. The revolution was the change in the hearts and minds of the colonists. If not for the Great Awakening leading a church revival, the revolution would not have happened as it did. As far as the foundation of American government, during the Revolutionary War, the faith of the Continental Congress was tested early. The leaders who led the colonies into war against Britain knew that if they lost, they would be executed. Early in the war, the Continental Army was losing and appeared to be on the road to defeat. The Continental Congress had to flee Philadelphia and went to York, Pennsylvania, when the British took over Philadelphia. Some in the Congress were debating whether or not to surrender and plead to the king for mercy. Samuel Adams stood up and told the Congress that the eyes of the world were on them. He suggested that the Congress pray and turn to God for leadership. The Congress did just that. A short time later, the colonial army won the Battle of Saratoga, which is often called the turning point in the Revolutionary War. George Washington, as commander of the Continental Army, spent a lot of time in prayer and seeking God's guidance. His spiritual mentality spread to his troops. After the war, Washington acknowledged the work of God in the independence of America. At the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin urged the delegates to open each morning with prayer, and the delegates did just that. When Washington was sworn in as president in April of 1789 in New York City, which was the capital city at first under the Constitution, he gave his inaugural address at Federal Hall, and then he and the first Congress went to a church and began the new government in prayer. During the early days under the Constitution, the Capitol building served as a church on Sundays. Many politicians that went included Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Washington, D.C. was new at the time and just being built. There were no churches at first. Later, numerous churches would be built and obviously used for worship. When it was agreed to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to fix the Articles of Confederation, the states each chose delegates to send. The delegates came to the Constitutional Convention with this foundation in Judeo-Christian principles and a thirst for liberty and justice for all. The Founding Fathers aimed to create a constitutional republic that limited the government. The Constitutional Convention met for 4 months. The 55 delegates were seldom all together at once because the weather was bad and travel was difficult. About 35 delegates were present during the process of the writing of the Constitution. Rhode Island didn't send delegates as it was fearful of a stronger federal government. The smallest state would ratify the Constitution last once there was a guarantee of a Bill of Rights. They did so almost a year after Washington became the first president. In 1785, 2 years before the convention, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had been exchanging letters on the problems facing the new nation and a need to fix these problems. They wanted a convention but needed someone to lead it that everyone in the nation respected and trusted. That would be George Washington. George Washington served as the presiding officer leading the convention. He had high popularity and much respect due to his leadership of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. Only the leadership of a man such as Washington would be able to make the convention a success. Washington had to keep orderly debates. This would be difficult due to the numerous opinions at the convention. Benjamin Franklin was the peacekeeper at the convention. He was the oldest delegate there, and he had grown in wisdom due to experiences as an early colonial leader. As mentioned, Franklin urged prayer to open all debates. He said, "If God notices a sparrow falling to the earth, how can a great empire rise without his notice?" At the Constitutional Convention, he was able to temper hard feelings during debates. James Madison is often referred to as the father of the Constitution since he played a major role in introducing and developing the key principles of the Constitution. Also, he took notes on the debates at the convention. This is the reason we know what took place inside the convention since it was held in secret and closed to the public and the media. Madison would be in the House of Representatives under the beginning of the Constitution and was the one who proposed and pushed the Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton from New York was one who favored strengthening the federal government. He attended the previous convention in Annapolis in which only 5 states were present. After the Constitution was completed, he, along with James Madison and John Jay, were active in pushing for approval. They wrote the Federalist Papers. Hamilton would be America's first Secretary of the Treasury and looked to sway the start of the nation towards manufacturing and industry. He also pushed the creation of a United States National Bank. James Wilson from Pennsylvania was the second most active delegate at the convention and spoke on the floor 168 times. He led the ratification efforts in Pennsylvania. He was one of only 6 to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Wilson was appointed as one of the first 6 justices on the first Supreme Court under the Constitution. While on the court, he felt it was necessary to have law books and law schools to teach future generations about American law. He wrote that good civil law is based on divine law, indicating that American law is based on biblical values. Some of America's key founders during the movement for independence and the war weren't there. Thomas Jefferson, as the ambassador to France, was in France helping to maintain that key alliance. John Adams was the ambassador to Britain looking to reestablish trade and relations. Samuel Adams and John Hancock weren't there. Patrick Henry turned down an invitation to go, saying that he smelled a rat. Henry was one of the anti-federalists. Not all of the delegates who were there were happy with the results and therefore didn't sign. Such delegates were Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason of Virginia. Mason was also one of the leading anti-federalists who wanted a Bill of Rights.
The Constitution is really born out of the Declaration of Independence. You have no clue of understanding the Constitution if you don't have a good grasp on the Declaration. 85 words right up top that give you 5 fundamental principles of American government. Those five thoughts are real simple. The first one says, hey, we believe there's a creator. We in government believe that. Number 2, we believe the creator gives certain specific guaranteed and alienable rights to man. And number 3, we believe that government exists to protect those specific rights. They say now below that there is a moral law. They call it the laws of nature. Nature's God. 8 words out of the Declaration that came from a law book of the day. That's the 4th point. And then they say below that moral law we have the consent of the governed. So those 5 specific things, you take those 5 points and move them over to the Constitution, and now you start understanding the Constitution. George Washington got a bunch of them together and said, we really need to look at redoing the Articles of Confederation, which led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they did get together and they said, let's redo the Articles of Confederation. They looked at that and said, let's just scrap it and start again. And that's where we come up with the Constitution. When you look at the founders' idea for the nation, it was that the people would be in charge through a representative federal government. And out of the forms of government, the Founding Fathers went through and said democracy is worse than anything. It's worse than anarchy. Democracy is worse than a monarchy, and we know what they thought about monarchies. I mean, democracy was on the bottom of the rung because it allowed human emotions to get through. People make decisions when they're angry or when they're happy or when they don't have all the facts. So in a representative Republican form of government, everything slows down. And we complain about the pace of government, but that's really good because now you have to debate, you have to get 2 sides in there, you have to look at all the aspects, you have hearings on it to get all the information. It's a slow process, but it keeps the feelings and emotions out. But they wanted the people to have the power. The Constitution forbids America from becoming a democracy, and a federal government means that we share powers in a vertical direction. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, he went through his president and said, the purpose of federal government is fivefold. And in his inaugural address, he listed the 5 things that the government was supposed to do. He said, number 1 is to acknowledge and adore God. Now, it's interesting, Jefferson said that, but they all believed that if you don't start with acknowledgement of God, you don't understand inalienable rights. Second thing is for government to exercise frugality. Frugality in spending and power and authority. Be a frugal government. He said third is to restrain the infliction of injury. Government exists to keep bad guys under control. It's not to regulate the good guys, it's to keep the bad guys from hurting somebody. He said the fourth thing government's supposed to do is to encourage entrepreneurship and free enterprise. It's to be business friendly and encourage, because that's where prosperity comes from, that's where jobs come from. He said the fifth thing government's to do is to protect property and the earnings of citizens. They considered the money you earned as your property, and they couldn't take your money away from you any more than they could take your house or your property or anything else away. And he said that's the fivefold purpose of government. Government exists for those 5 reasons. We've shifted so much away from what they envisioned, which was a small, limited government with 5 primary responsibilities, where that we, the people, were in charge of all 3 branches. That's what they wanted for America. And if we read and study the Constitution and get back to that plan, that's what's caused America to be the most prosperous, stable nation in the history of the world. Today, we like to say Madison's the father of the Constitution, but that really is not an accurate statement. Now, Madison had an influence, no question about it, and he's really the scribe of the convention. He wrote everything down. But Madison very wisely made a statement back as an older man. People were looking at him and said, man, you must have had a remarkable influence in the Constitution. He said, no. He said, you can't look at this document as being the result of one head or one mind. This was the result of many heads and many minds. You've also got folks like Roger Sherman, who came up with the whole bicameral concept, where we have a House and a Senate. One represents the states, one represents the people. That dual and that was a big deal for them, because they said, you know, electing a president, this is not a good deal, because we have 13 colonies, but there's enough people in Massachusetts, and there's enough people in New York and Pennsylvania. Those 3 states can get together and elect the president, and the other 10 colonies, we got nothing to say over it. So they didn't like this thing of just the population doing it, but they didn't like the thing of just the states doing it, because they wanted the people to have a voice. So Roger Sherman comes up with the bicameral concept, and by the way, that's the basis of the electoral college system, which is such a cool system. People don't understand it today, but the president, if he only had to be elected by the people, he would never leave the East Coast or the West Coast. You also have James Wilson, who's called a master builder of the Constitution. He was actually the second most active member at the Constitutional Convention. Spoke at the floor of the convention 168 times. He was an original justice on the Supreme Court once we ratified the Constitution. He's a big voice. Charles Pinckney out of South Carolina. He had more winning proposals than any other member of the Constitutional Convention, but nobody ever hears of Charles Pinckney. And you really have to look at the Constitution as a result of all of it.
Only the Congress can coin money, not print it, coin it. So it was kept in precious metals. So you couldn't flood the market with phony dollars, as we've been doing since 1913.
When we look at where we are today as citizens, the condition of the country is always a reflection of we the people and what we ourselves know about the Constitution. There are so many things that are out there, constitutional myths. We the people, by and large, do not know our Constitution very well. It's worth reading every single year. It takes about 20 minutes to do it. That's what will turn the country around, is we the people knowing that document and using that document.
What is the code in the Constitution? It's easy. Do you think that was a font problem that somebody said, hey, scale it down, we the people, it's too big, it's not all going to fit on a page? No, that was code. They knew that it had to send a message. They knew people would get lost. They wouldn't know the answer. They'd get detached from the Constitution. Jefferson and Adams talked about it in their letters back and forth. So what did they do? They wanted to make a point. Hey, dummy, look, we the people is the answer.
I love the way that James Wilson said this. James Wilson, one of the guys who wrote the Constitution, he says, here in America, he says, the people are the masters of government. He says, in Europe, the government is masters of the people. And that's the big deal. We the people was always to remind our elected officials and ourselves that, hey, government's here to serve us. We're not here to serve government.